A Case Against Child Labor Prohibitions by Benjamin Powell, July 29, 2014. Halima, paragraph 1. Halima is an 11-year-old girl who clips loose threads off of Hanes underwear in a Bangladeshi factory. She works about 8 hours a day, 6 days per week. She has to process 150 pairs of underwear an hour. At work, she feels very tired and exhausted, and sometimes falls asleep standing up. She makes 53 cents a day for her efforts. Make no mistake, it is a rough life. Any decent person's heart would go out to Halima and other child employees like her. Unfortunately, all too often, people's emotional reaction lead them to advocate policies that will harm the very children they intend to help. Provisions against child labor are part of the International Labor Organization's core labor standards. Anti-sweatshop groups almost universally condemn child labor and call for laws prohibiting child employment or boycotting products made with child labor. 2. In my recent book, Out of Poverty, Sweatshops in the Global Economy, I argue that much of what the anti-sweatshop movement agitates for would harm workers, and that the process of economic development, in which sweatshops play an important role, is the best way to raise wages and improve working conditions. Child labor, although the most emotionally charged aspect of sweatshops, is not an exception to this analysis. 3. We should desire to see an end to child labor, but it has to come through a process that generates better opportunities for the children, not from legislative mandates that prevent children and their families from taking the best option available to them. Children work because their families are desperately poor, and the meager addition to the family income they can contribute is often necessary for survival. Banning child labor through trade regulations or governmental prohibitions often simply forces the children into less desirable alternatives. When U.S. activists started pressuring Bangladesh into eliminating child labor, the results were disastrous. 4. Effects of child labor bans. In 1993, Senator Tom Harkin, Democrat from Iowa, introduced the Child Labor Deterrence Act, which would have banned imports from countries employing children. In response, that fall, Bangladeshi garment companies let go approximately 50,000 children. According to the U.S. Department of Labor, it is widely thought that most of them have found employment in other garment factories, in smaller, unregistered, subcontracting garment workshops, or in other sectors. That makes the introduction of the bill seem simply ineffective. The Department of Labor is sugarcoating the situation. Paul Krugman summarizes what happened more bluntly. The direct result was that Bangladeshi textile factories stopped employing children. But did the children go back to school? Did they return to happy homes? Not according to Oxfam, which found that the displaced child workers ended up in even worse jobs or on the streets, and that a significant number were forced into prostitution. Based on the information they have, families tend to choose the best available job for their children. Taking that option away does not eliminate the necessity of work. It forces them to take a less desirable job. As repulsive as a child working in a sweatshop may be, it is not nearly as repulsive as a child forced into prostitution through the acts of unthinking Western activists. 5. The Bangladesh story is a dramatic one, but it illustrates the general point that when children lose factory jobs, they find less desirable jobs to replace the jobs they lost. In countries where sweatshops locate, child labor is often the norm, and most of the children work in less remunerative sectors with fewer opportunities for advancement than manufacturing, such as agriculture or domestic services. The World Bank also collects data on the economic sectors in which children are employed. Figure 1 presents the distribution of employment of economically active children between the ages of 7 and 14 by sector. Figure 1. On the left, percentage employed. So children employed by sector. So here's the percent. On the left, the bar going up, 62%, 55%, 79%. Going across, what countries? And the darkness of the shade indicates whether it is agriculture, services, or manufacturing. So in Bangladesh, 62% in agriculture, 23% in services, 12% in manufacturing. Number 6. In 7 of the 9 countries for which data exists, most children were employed in agriculture, often by a wide margin. In the 2 exceptions, Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic, the leading sector employing children was service. India had the highest proportion of children employed in manufacturing, and there it was a little over 14%. Protests against sweatshops that use child labor implicitly assume that ending child labor in sweatshops by taking away the option to work in a factory will, on net, reduce child labor. Evidence on child labor in countries that have sweatshops indicates that is wrong. It is not a few bad apple firms exploiting children in factories. Child labor is common. Employment in agriculture is not necessarily safer either. A 1997 child labor survey showed that 12% of children working in agriculture reported injuries, compared with 9% of those who worked in manufacturing. Child labor and economic development. The thought of third world children toiling in factories to produce garments for us in the developed world to wear is appalling, at least in part because child labor is virtually non-existent in the United States and the rest of the more developed world. Virtually nowhere in the developed world do kids toil long hours every week in a factory in a manner that prevents them from obtaining schooling. 7. Children typically worked throughout human history, either long hours in agriculture or in factories once the Industrial Revolution emerged. The question is, why don't kids work today? Rich countries do have laws against child labor, but so do many poor countries. In Costa Rica, the legal working age is 15, but an ILO survey found 43% of working children were under the legal age. Similarly, in the United States, Massachusetts passed the first restriction on child labor in 1842. However, that law and other states' laws affected child labor nationally very little. By one estimate, more than 25% of males between the ages of 10 and 15 participated in the labor force in 1900. Another study of both boys and girls in that age group estimated that more than 18% of them were employed in 1900. Economist Carolyn Moling also found little evidence that minimum age laws for manufacturing implemented between 1880 and 1910 contributed to the decline in child labor. Similarly, economists Claudia Golden and Larry Katz examined the period between 1910 and 1939 and found that child labor laws and compulsory school attendance laws could explain at most 5% of the increase in high school enrollment. The United States did not enact a national law limiting child labor until the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in 1938. By that time, the U.S. average per capita income was more than $10,000 in 2010 dollars. You can look up what it would be today. 8. Furthermore, child labor was defined much more narrowly when today's wealthy countries first prohibited it. Massachusetts law limited children who were under 12 years old to no more than 10 hours of work per day. Belgium in 1886, France in 1847, prohibited only children under the age of 12 from working. Germany in 1891 set the minimum working wage at 13. England, which passed its first enforceable child labor law in 1833, merely set the minimum age for textile work at 9 years old. When these countries were developing, they simply did not put in place the type of restrictions on child labor that activists demand for third world countries today. Binding legal restrictions came only after child labor had mostly disappeared. 9. The main reason children do not work in wealthy countries is precisely because they are wealthy. The relationship between child labor and income is striking. Using the same World Bank data on child labor participation rates, we can observe how child labor varies with per capita income. Figure 2 divides countries into 5 groups based on their level of per capita income, adjusted for purchasing power parity. In the richest 2/5 of countries, all of whose incomes exceed $12,000 in 2010 dollars, child labor is virtually non-existent. Figure 2. Percent of children aged 10 to 14 in labor force by country income. So countries with the highest income, countries with the lowest income, right here, $600 to $2K, 31.04% are in the labor workforce, children ages 10 to 14. Countries with an average income of $2,000 to $6,000 a year, 7.35% of children are in the labor force. Countries with 6K to 11K, 4.58%, 11 to 24, 0.16, over 24K, 0.01%. And let me just add here, remember that I said that the figures for the United States was about 500,000. Because there are so many children in the US, that represents a very, very, very small percent of the children who are in the US. But when we still look at that raw number, 500,000, to most of us, it still seems too high. Number 10. It is only when countries have an income less than $11,000 per year that we start to observe children in the labor force. But even here, rates of child labor remain relatively low through both the third and fourth quintiles. It is the poorest countries where rates of child labor explode. More than 30% of children work in the fifth of countries with incomes ranging from $600 to $2,000 per year. Economists Eric Edmonds and Nina Pavchik econometrically estimate that 73% of the variation of child labor rates can be explained by variation in GDP per capita. 11. Of course, correlation is not causation. But in the case of child labor and wealth, the most intuitive interpretation is that increased wealth leads to reduced child labor. After all countries were once poor. In the countries that became rich, child labor disappeared. Few would contend that child labor disappeared in the United States or Great Britain prior to economic growth taking place. Children populated their factories much as they do in the Third World today. A little introspection, or for that matter, our moral indignation at Third World child labor, reveals that most of us desire that children, especially our own, do not work. Thus, as we become richer and can afford to allow children to have leisure and education, we choose to. Conclusion. The thought of children laboring in sweatshops is repulsive, but that does not mean we can simply think with our hearts and not our heads. Families who send their children to work in sweatshops do so because they are poor, and it is the best available alternative open to them. The vast majority of children employed in countries with sweatshops, work in lower productivity sectors than manufacturing. Passing trade sanctions or other laws that take away the option of children working in sweatshops only limits their options further and throws them into worse alternatives. Luckily, as families escape poverty, child labor declines. As countries become rich, child labor virtually disappears. The answer for how to cure child labor lies in the process of economic growth, a process in which sweatshops play an important role. If you're interested in this topic, there are many, many resources that you can go and read about. Challenges and Perspectives in Child Labor, Stop Child Labor and UNICEF in Action, What If Anything is Wrong with Child Labor? There are things that we can do to help stop child labor, but it is important to recognize or to try and investigate what are actually the root causes of a problem before you just try to throw solutions at it that may or may not be effective, or that may cause even worse problems than what you are hoping to resolve.